that helps to bring us that helps to bring us together in our endeavours over this next hour. Ki hora te marino, ki whakapapa punamu te Moana, hei huarahi mā tātou I te rangi nei. Araha atu, araha mai, tātou I a tātou katoa, hui e tai ki e. So a rough translation of that is, may peace be widespread, may the sea be like greenstone, a pathway for all of us this day. Let us show respect for each other, for one another, bind us all together. It's my great pleasure to welcome Reverend Professor Upolu Luma Vaai as our speaker today. Many of you may know Professor Vaai is a leading Pacific indigenous philosopher and a theologian specialising in eco-relational theology, decolonizing education and relational hermeneutics. He is currently the principal of the Pacific Theological College, which is an ecumenical theological college owned by 20 Pacifica churches and based in Fiji. Professor Vaai will talk on the topic of whole of life education that is embedded in a decolonial and community-based approach. So the format today is that Professor Vaai will speak for roughly 30 minutes and then we'll have time for questions and answers at the end of that. So if you have questions and answers, as you think of them as the webinar is going on, please put them into the Q&A below and then we'll look at those towards the end. So now it's my great honour to pass over to you, Upolu, and ask you to speak to your webinar. Kia ora.
Thank you, Alana. Pulavinaka and Talofa from the Pacific Theological College in Suva, Fiji. I speak from the land that was formerly owned by Suva people, to Suva and his people, in which the college is located on. I'm indeed honored to be invited by the Nitro Oceania Group to deliver this presentation on a search for a communities-based approach to learning grounded in Pacifica philosophy of relationality. I begin with two disclaimers. First is that I'm not an expert on secular education. I'm a theological educator and indigenous philosopher who is more interested in asking questions about the theological and philosophical underpinnings of our development models and frameworks, and in this case, educational development. Second is that my presentation is clustered around my personal journey as a village boy, struggling to make sense of education for almost 30 years now. I am still navigating and seeking the Northern Star. Next slide, please. Let me state at the outset that by affirming that this lecture is based on a thesis that from a village boy perspective, education is a relationship, not a mere academy, a journey with multiple baskets that hold different knowledge systems. It is more about relating and mentoring for transformative leadership than about teaching. Let me start with my village boy story. I grew up in the islands in Samoa all of my life. I grew up around my father, who was a fisherman, a farmer, and a talking chief, and around my mother, who was a weaver and a traditional healer. But most of the times I grew up mostly around my uncles and aunties. I grew up as a member of the Aumanga, an association of village young men who normally participate in village young men fishing exhibitions, serving the house of the chiefs through food and other services, serving village funerals and weddings, becoming the hands and the feet of local church in many of its activities, and of course, serving the many ceremonies such as bestowal of chiefly titles, annual Thanksgiving ceremonies, and reconciliation ceremonies. Next. When I transitioned to tertiary education, I began to experience in depth the tension between community learning and the academy, framed under formal and informal learning. This struggle is represented by three tensions. One, is a tension between the communal and the individual. 2, tradition and modernity. And 3, the spirituality and the secular. What I know in all of my years as a young indigenous island person who grew up in a village went out the window when I entered the halls of tertiary education, and in particular, theological education. Next slide. Like many Pacific Islanders educated in Western education systems, I struggled to bridge these two separate worlds. O le lalolangi o whatinonga, the world of praxis and living experiences in the communities that emphasize the communal, spiritualities, and subjectivity, ma le lalolangi o mafofonga, and the world of academic theory that emphasize modernity, the secular, and objectivity. The former is a world shaped and driven by multiple living relationships. The later is a world shaped and driven by theories. Well, we often ordained and call it formal knowledge or formal learning. Consequently, while the later became more and more dictating, my life became more and more unsettled with our education system. So while I acknowledge that education has contributed more to national and regional development than any other sector, I feel that today our education system has still not gone far enough to bridge the divide between the communities and the academy. Many educators has for years pushed for an education that is inclusive and holistic, that acknowledges Pacifica communities, cultures, and knowledge systems. Educators such as Konai Thaman, Unaisina Bobobamba, Linda Smith, Robert Underwood from the Northern Pacific, Anna Taufeulunaki, Taero Tewei Ariki, and many others. I would really love to hear whether we have moved forward on this. Next slide. Island people, on the one hand, learn through negotiating first with the inner seat of knowledge. Mauhinui calls this inner seat, or the core of a person, they call it opu. Hawaiians call it na'au. Samoans call it fatumanava, the heart or the gore of being. Fijians call it yalo matua. The outcome of this negotiation informs one's obligations to the land, customs, culture, and relationships. Therefore, individuals are always perceived through the frame of the collective. Knowledge is perceived through the rhythms of relationships. Communities negotiate life through the lens of multiple intersections and connections. In this context, learning is a collective event. Knowledge, therefore, is an embodiment of collective values. This is why communities prefer to take a yatulasi learning approach, a multi-layered or multi-strand learning approach that is not locked within a certain box or category. This is because communities-based learning is about life, and education, standards, and policies are normally negotiated to serve this goal. Next slide, please. On the other hand, in the academy, we teach students through a atutasi learning approach, a single-layered or a single-strand learning approach. We normally perceive students as mere individuals, isolated and autonomous, a thinking person driven by the paradigm of rationality. As a result, we tend to push knowledge to the abstract realm by removing subjectivity, emotions, and connections of students to what constitutes them as relational beings. We teach that objectivity is primary. that we teach that methods, Eurocentric methods of analysis are more accurate. As a result, we fall prey to the narrative of oneification in our education models, where we are forced to conform to one culture, one model, one language, or one way of learning. We promote that understanding through rational categories and binaries are more reliable if we need to achieve scientific precision and results. We promote that departmentalism is the best way to achieve specific learning goals. We also teach that literary mode of documenting and passing down knowledge is the only legitimate form, and that the market should be the focus if profit and employability is the goal. Consequently, the academy promotes a head-driven education, a thinking-driven education apart from action, disrupting the balance of the 3H, the head, the hands, and the heart, outlined in our Pacific Accreditation strategies. Next slide. This head-driven education contributed to the separation of spirituality and the secular, or in the case of this presentation, theological education from that of secular education. This is a separation influenced by the biased stereotypes that theological education deals too much with faith and spirituality and less with secular and scientific learning. Again, it's a fracturing and it's a separation that does not exist in communities-based learning. But theological education is also not immune from the colonial intrusion. For example, theological education has been solely shaped by the obsession for objectivity. When interpreting the Bible, the Pacific Island reader, for example, of the Bible, must avoid any cultural or contextual associations and presuppositions and be objective as possible in order to find the true meaning of the Bible text. Following the Cartesian's clean slate principle, it means that the Islander reader needs to sever all relationships with his or her culture, his ainga, and also with the vuvale, to avoid preconditioned ideas and to objectively ascertain the true meaning of the Bible text. It's like a blind date with the Bible, reading and interpreting the Bible without us, without our whole being intact. But this is not just in relation to biblical interpretation or biblical hermeneutics. This is also a rule of objectivity also taught in many literacy classes around the Pacific. So perhaps Edward Goldsmith probably put it more directly: there is no better way to destroy a people than to undermine their education system, end of quote. There's a whole series of rethinking education curriculum in the Pacific that I invite the participants and the listeners to engage with. My goal here is to provide some principles to assist with the communities-based education and learning. Next slide, please. Relationality is a philosophy of relationships. In many Pacifica communities, relatedness is the core principle that guides knowledge production and directs ethical decisions and praxis. In these communities, relationality is the most sacred primordial form of knowledge. Recently, theology also captured the importance of relationality as well as a sacred primordial form of knowledge. With relationality as the undergirding pillar, many communities' learning systems are geared towards producing relational-oriented thinkers, transforming them to be resilient leaders and ecological-oriented keepers. Fluid and flexible without a center, communities do not think through the lens of one-dimensional compartmentalized systems that we often teach in the academy. In this way, relationality has something to offer if we are really serious about restoring education. Next slide, please. Let me give 5 examples of communities-based principles based on the philosophy of relationality, and that can assist in restoring education. But certainly, it's not confined to these 5. Next. Communities-based learning is always transboundary. Communities were not raised to be compartmentalized thinkers. They were raised to be transboundary and whole-of-life thinkers. Therefore, any communities-based learning approach should seriously consider the idea of flow and fluidity. Relationality offers us the ability to negotiate relationships. We negotiate spaces. We negotiate structures and policies. We negotiate knowledge for the sake of life. This is couched in a Samoan saying, for example, the wisdom of the fool is fixed, while the wisdom of the wise is negotiable. Negotiability is critical to transboundary and transdisciplinary thinking. It is also critical if we are to challenge the rule of conformity in our education systems. Take, for example, the Itaukei Fijian community's totemistic culture. Fijians were brought up in their communities to value the importance of having a tree that represents the land, a fish that represents the sea, and a bird that represents the sky. This triadic or this Trinitarian cosmic thinking of land, sea, and skies is a holistic awareness that reminds people not only of their deep connection to the earth and therefore their ecological responsibility, but also to remind them of the inter and transboundary flow of everything that contributes to the well-being of life. This Itaukei worldview is critical if we need to challenge the cult of conformity that is promoted by our education systems. Education as a relationship does not have to create strict, immovable boundaries, even if we are trying to focus on a specific goal or a specific major. There needs to be a flexibility to allow the students to create their own stories rather than being given a story. Next. Community-based learning is always about the collective. To move forward, we need to re-evaluate the academy's relationship with the concept of tamata or ta'ata, or person in English. Education deals with persons every day. Therefore, understanding the philosophy of person is critically important. In the Pacific, individuals are relational beings. We cannot be humans alone. We are never alone where we were born. A person is born out of and into a house of multiple relationships. We live with our ancestors and our ecological relatives in that house. A person, therefore, did not invent relationship, but rather continues it. Everything around us shows that we are independent only in our interdependence. We are individuals only in our relations. Therefore, our point of departure is not the I, but rather the we, the tato. Thus, the initial horizon for understanding and interpreting the world is not the I, but rather the we. This doesn't mean that the I is not, of course, not important. That's not the case that I'm arguing here. This colonial chronological structure of thinking is shallow to capture the complexity and multiplicity of relationalities. Rather, it means that the I is constituted by multiple relationships. Therefore, because the I is a we, a person is always a plural I, not a singular I. We deal with a plural I in the academy every day through our students, through our staff, through our leaders, through everyone who enters the hall of education. I live in a house that is shared. I eat fish that I did not feed. I live in a land with ancestral footprints. I carry the blood that belongs to my mother, so I only hold it in trust. My pute is not just a belly button. It is the window of immeasurable connection to the earth. My culture is a library of ancestral memory. My language is a storehouse of ecological well-being. When we say loloma in Fiji, we're not just saying it for the sake of speech. We are in fact entering into a house of multiple inestimable relationships, a world of deep solidarity of sharing, a culture of gratitude and gifting. From a decolonial perspective, we cannot strictly define life based on a popular category such as tradition and modernity, communal and individual, subjectivity and objectivity. There are no such categories in communities-based thinking and learning. There is only community constituted by inter and outer flows of relationships and mana. This is what the va, or the wa, the relational space, is all about. It's about connection and disconnection. It's about unity and distinction. It's about separation and joining. And negotiation and negotiability is very critical to the notion of the va. In communities, we think kinship through individuality. We think connection through distinction. We think in the light of the whole through transboundary and multidimensionality. Perhaps one of the reasons why the Academy fears community-based learning is the sense of complexity that comes with the idea of the collective. This is because the literary urge of mainstream education and its focus to prove an absolute objective truth as its primary task makes it hard for the Academy to adopt learning that is premised on complex structures and relationships. Take, for example, orality. Most Pacific cultures are oral cultures. Oral story is the matrix of Pacific knowledge. It does not focus on one dimension of a story or event or a people. Therefore, multidimensionality, it is multidimensional and inclusive. Learning to embrace complex systems, bodies, stories, and relationships cannot work in one-dimensional system of learning. Perhaps we can start by treating students as a collective that shape their being and knowing, and not as mere individuals. They don't just represent communities, they are communities. Next. Yeah. Communities-based learning is about custodianship. With the many economic, ecological, and climate crises emerging around the world today, education needs to go back to one of the central pillars of communities-based learning, and that is custodianship. Custodianship of land, ocean, culture, identity cannot be properly learned in classrooms. This is because it is only properly learned through relationships. Custodianship is woven into the everyday custodian structure of life in the communities. It is linked to cultural and ecological values and principles. Custodianship education starts in the early age where young people in the communities are encouraged to know their connection and responsibilities to those connections. Language is key to this relationship. any language is critical to embracing the values of custodianship education. To ensure that these values cut across all aspects of the academy, including its vision and throughout its structures, we need to ensure that language is a priority for educational institutions to maintain. And I mean indigenous languages and communities-based languages. This notion of custodianship is pushed by the recently approved 2050 Blue Pacific Strategy, which states, and I quote, "We place great value on our ocean and land and celebrate deep connection to our community, natural environment, resources, livelihoods, faith, cultural values, and traditional knowledge," end of quote. Recently, it has been acknowledged that because our people, especially our young people, are nurtured alongside the land and the seas, therefore their full potential is achieved only when we use custodianship language, concepts, and approaches in the academy. Next, please. Communities-based learning is about accountability. Because of the centrality of relationships, learning in the communities normally goes through an accountability process. Accountable to the people is central in communities-based learning. In a new 2050 Blue Pacific Strategy that was approved last week through the Pacific Forum Leaders Meeting, in its thematic area 2, emphasizes a people-centered development. If this needs to work, then accountability to the people is critical. We are accountable to the communities because of three things. First, they are owners of knowledge. Many researchers, after their field research, claim to own the knowledge that belongs to the communities. This sense of knowledge ownership immediately sidelines accountability to promote our ego as academics. We need to hold our institutions into account, hold researchers into account of taking knowledge that belongs to communities without proper protocols and communities' consent. It means also strengthening institutional assessment mechanisms that encourages institutional accountability. Secondly, because of the employment and profit-driven agenda of conventional education, it has somehow disconnected people from their communities. And I speak from the perspective and from the experience that I have in the islands. Normally, successful graduates don't normally return to serve their communities, but rather prefer to stay in urban areas to pursue a different career opportunity beneficial to them. While this is, of course, a personal choice, it is also partly a responsibility of the academy due to its market-driven agenda. For many years, we have naturalized that knowledge is built to support the machinery of economic and political interests. This, of course, gradually shifted the accountability of knowledge from communities to the academy. And third, the accountability of education to communities is about liberation. Education is about justice. Education is about liberation, Paulo Freire reminds us. Therefore, the structures, the curriculum, and the conceptual vocabularies of the academy need to be redesigned with meanings that emerge from the struggles and the displacements of the communities to propose alternative forms of justice and ways of knowing that are transformative and liberating. Next. And the last principle is that communities-based learning is about resilience. First, let me start by saying that resilience starts with learning again to trust what we have around us, in our environment, in our houses, in our vanua, in our cultures and contexts as tools of survival and sustainability. It starts with the conviction that what is best for the Pacific is how the Pacific sees it, not how other countries see it. That is at the heart of the 2050 Blue Pacific Strategy launched last week in Suva. Second, resilience is highly possible if our mindsets are not fixed in a one-dimensional approach or educational method. It is impossible to affirm a sense of resilience if our education system has a linear approach that only teaches a one-dimensional focus. Growing up in cultures where the intersection of multiple structures and relationships are normal, where responsibility normally flows from the house to the land, to the sea and back again, Pacific students are likely to acquire the ability to easily master the interplay and interflow of focuses, disciplines, and approaches in educational institutions. It's just that we need to allow them to be. The vision of the Pacific leaders in the 2050 Blue Pacific Strategy states that, and I quote, "Our vision is for a resilient Pacific region of peace, harmony, security, social inclusion, and prosperity that ensures all Pacific people can lead free, healthy, and productive lives." End of quote. This means a shift of educational focus from serving the extractive ideologies of the market into serving the people. We need to teach our young people to be resilient leaders in the future, responsible for the security and the protection of our lands and oceans, to be able to make responsible decisions for the region. Next slide. To conclude, we cannot avoid the fact that the pandemic, quoting from Walter Mignolo, and I quote, "has accelerated a process that is irreversible and provided more evidence that the long-lasting consequences of coloniality are no longer hidden under the rhetoric of modernity, development, progress, growth of more is better." End of growth. As educators, we need to open our eyes to see these colonial consequences already exposed by the pandemic. Perhaps we still have to deal with two technical challenges, and I only bring two, but I'm sure there are many. First is curriculum. Today, it is evident that Pacific core values central to communities' well-being do not underpin many Pacific curriculum, and I'm not the first one who argues this point. And the Pacific people are solely responsible for this. We are responsible for this. And while others may argue that all curriculum have common values, we need to realize that values and ethics are culture and context specific. How courageous are we to radically change our curriculum to be inclusive of communities' values and well-being? And second is accreditation. The institution that I'm leading, the Pacific Theological College, has engaged many communities in Fiji and around the region as co-curricular writers for the purpose of renewing our curriculum and rebuilding an education system to capture the whole of life vision of the Pacific and a communities-based approach to learning. The challenge is not just including the communities as centers of knowledge, changing our mindsets from doing business as usual, but also the question of accreditation. How do we incorporate into our accreditation frameworks topics such as spiritualities and values that cannot be measured according to the Pacific qualification framework, heavily influenced by previous accreditation standards? If we need to dance differently to acknowledge the communities-based learning principles mentioned above, how far accreditation authorities will go to endorse such move? Which brings me to the last question of deconstructing our curricular mindsets. Questions such as, whose standards are we using? Are the accreditation guidelines serving the people or just the institutions? How flexible are the accreditation standards and guidelines to listen to decolonial stories and experiences of the people in the dirt communities, in particular the Pacific. There is a shift from post-colonial criticism to decoloniality, which I don't have time here to articulate in depth. But what is important is that both movements acknowledge that there is a darker side in our borrowed systems and models responsible for naturalizing and defending a certain racist rhetoric of educational domination, responsible for constant reproduction of coloniality in non-Western cultures such as the Pacific. Thank you very much.
Kia ora. Thank you so much for that, Upolu. That is a fabulous overview of a very complex and multi-layered and quite challenging range of issues, I think, for anybody who's working in education. Look, we've got a couple of questions that have come through, so I will read these out and ask for you to kind of respond as you see fit. So, so from Diana Gonzalez Botero, thank you, Professor. A lot of food for thought. I'm wondering about how do you think decolonial approaches and gender equality, understood as a Western concept and often encouraged by international donors, can be reconciled? How can we promote gender equality in communities while adopting a decolonizing approach and worldview?
Thank you. Gender equality is one of the sensitive issues that needs to be discussed more and more in the community. I just want to raise two aspects that perhaps can help out. First is that, what do we mean by gender equality? Is it a gender equality framed from the UN systems or from other contexts? How do we see gender equality within the complexity of our systems and structures in the Pacific? So it means that we have to go back to understanding this complexity of how we see people and how we treat people in the communities. That's the first response. Second is that some of our values, for example, the va, fa'aloalo, or tauhi va, and other values that are very dear to us in the Pacific, has been used to justify gender inequality. And that is one of the sad story and discovery in many parts of the Pacific, because we claim it's culture, but it's not culture when we are destroying a life, which is part of another gender. So I'm suggesting that first we have to critically analyze what we mean by gender equality from a community-based perspective. It means that we have to go back and understanding the multi-layered and the complexity of how we do things in relationships with chiefs, with young people, with women in the communities. And secondly, is that we also have to decolonize and deconstruct our own values that have become culture and normalized as the normal in our cultures that discriminate against women, for example, or against men in that respect.
Kia ora, thank you. So I've got a couple of questions, might be different, anonymous attendee. So somebody's asked, can you give concrete, specific examples of how a teacher can employ the principles of communities-based learning in their lessons?
That is a really good question, because it is a struggle that all of us teachers have, and it's a struggle that my institution also has. Perhaps other people here has wider experience of what are the practical ways that a teacher can approach a communities-based learning. We are moving towards a communities-based curriculum at the moment after the process. But we are also yet to move into what are the particulars that can help the teachers' learning and teaching approaches. So I'm not in a position to answer that until that is cleared as well. What I can say is that many of us Pacific Islanders people have a sort of a very different way of relating compared to others. So the mentoring aspect and the relating aspect is very key to a teacher-student relationship, and perhaps from there develop a more concrete way of associating and teaching the students as well. That means space, that means also negotiating space, negotiating policies, negotiating the timelines and all of that in order to fit a teacher's learning approach. So I hope, others who are more experienced than me in here would help with that, great question. It's a brilliant question that we still need to explore more.
Thank you. I mean, I agree. It's a great question. It's one that's certainly a challenge, but I like the way that you've kind of taken it back to that relationality, and so that there's no obvious, to me, in my mind anyway, there's no obvious kind of solution which is on a piece of paper that we can look to. We have to build this in our relationships. Fabulous. Thank you. So another question: how does a scholar researcher go about contributing to the current research literature of the decolonial communities-based approach, while remaining accountable to the communities they work with and learn from?
That's another really good question. There are two things that perhaps in the top of my mind that I can remember. One is that we need to acknowledge the custodians and the owners of that knowledge in our research. We need to acknowledge those. Some of the research that been done by a lot of people in the Pacific and outside of the Pacific has not been acknowledged. So there's a lot of stolen knowledge, so to say, if that is the correct way of putting it, because it's not properly acknowledged in the academia. Secondly, is that in our research, there are a lot of protocols that we need to go through when we go to field research, for example. It's not just starting a conversation through an emails, or starting to hop on a plane and then told to go to a community and then sit down and interview a person, and then that's it. There is multiple layers of protocols and rituals that a person will have to go through, but I only have to mention the one in the end, the one that the researcher will need to go back to the communities and take the research back to the communities and thank the communities and make sure that the protocol is also accompanying that journey back to the communities. Many of us who work on curriculum revision or curriculum creation, or many aspects of our work in research, we once we get the research and the knowledge that we want, we put it into a book or a publication, and that's it. We never return to the communities. And it comes back to the culture of gratitude and the culture of gifting, because this community gifted you their knowledge. It is our responsibility as researchers to go back and take back this gift to the communities. So it comes back to relationships again. It comes back to the culture of gifting, reciprocal receiving and giving and receiving, which is central to this idea of relationships. So research, as Linda Smith, Unai Sinabomo Bamba, and many others remind us that research, it's accompanied by multiple layers of relationships that we have to deal with. And part of that is one that I just mentioned, is going back, acknowledging the communities who own the knowledge that we have reproduced or taken to the world.
Thank you. So I have a question here from Tyler Keys. Says, white people probably aren't leaving Australia or the Pacific anytime soon. And I wholeheartedly agree that whole of life education and the principles that have been put forward should be how learning is structured. Where would you start to shift a Western-led education system or school that are perpetuating negative outcomes for all to this more holistic and empowering way of learning and living? Another easy question for you there.
Here's another not an easy question to answer, but these are all quick questions because they are questions that it means that there's a gap, that there is something that we need to focus on. Let me say initially that it depends on institutions, on how they accept and are flexible about this communities-based learning. Perhaps it starts with a curriculum, revisiting our curriculums. Perhaps it starts with revisiting our policies and structures. Perhaps it starts with people, with leadership, to start with that. I don't see that this is an easy thing to do because we still need to work hand in hand. You know, Western education system and Pacific education and Pacific knowledge, you know, have their own right and their own place and their own context. So relationality also looks at how can we work together, both you know, Western education knowledge and also Pacific education knowledge, to empower this kind of communities and to strengthen this kind of communities-based learning approach. There are a lot of people that are now beginning to decolonize, perhaps moving into a decolonial approach to education, but these are not easy steps to take. I don't really promote a kind of coup in education where we you know, topple another education system in favor of another education system. As I say, we carry multiple baskets of knowledge in the beginning of this presentation. And the challenge is how we come together to inform each other in this multiple baskets of knowledge that we have, multiple baskets of ideas that we have. It's also not easy. Well, you're asking the question about Australia, but it's a struggle as well in the Pacific, whom people are engaged with village communities every day. So it's also a struggle in the Pacific you know, institutions as well. And there's a struggle everywhere. And I believe it's a good struggle because it's something that we need to seek and learn and navigate carefully so that we don't exclude, but rather include. I hope that helps.
Kia ora, that's a great answer. I think just reflecting on what's been happening in Aotearoa New Zealand over the last year or so around mātauranga Māori and how that sits alongside Western science and some of the rather challenging conversations and around just how these different knowledge forms sit together. So this idea of different baskets of knowledge, which one doesn't necessarily promote or privilege one, but there's a kind of a negotiated discussion in particular context about how these knowledges come to play out. It feels to me that that's something which we're just starting to grapple with. And it's certainly a challenge for Pākehā and Palangi to do that. But I think one which, in terms of Nitro's agenda, in terms of looking at the grand challenges and for the world, we need these inter and transdisciplinary and indigenous knowledges working together. So enough from me. We have one probably last question. We might have two more questions, and then I'm just mindful that we will finish at 3 o'clock. So this is from Norbert Hintersteiner. I like your thought that complexity is a threat to one-sided academic learning, particularly complexity carried out by wisdom of communities. Isn't ever more an uncomfortable complexifying also always a goal of any academic learning? Aren't there also those experiences that communities often also are not enough complex in their thinking? So that's the question.
That's a great question as well. We are mindful of moving from non-complexity to over-complexifying things. But it depends on cultures and how they deal with complexities. For example, in the Pacific cultures, they have a way of dealing with complexities, and that is where the wa comes in, because the wa is the one that deals with, and I've explained that as well. But other cultures around the world should also have their own ways of dealing with complexity. I think the Vaai brings some the unity, but also unifying ideas, unifying values, or unifying the knowledge, but also at the same time acknowledging the complexity and the diversity of those knowledge or those ideas. So it's this space that is very important, which we call the relational space, the space that connects and separates, which is called the Vaai. And a lot of people like, people like, Manulani Maya and many others around the Pacific have been talking about the importance of the Vaai, or importance of this relational space, to tackle this over-complexifying of things, so that we are sort of weaving rather than de-weaving a lot of things. There's a lot of weaving that needs to be done, and that's where the space of the Vaai comes in. And I believe that this is not central to only Pacific people. It's also part of other cultures of rituals or values or ways of unweaving and reweaving knowledges or reweaving ideas. And I hope that tries to help that shift from uncomplexity to over-complexifying of things. Yeah.
Thank you. So look, we have one last question. So my question, so this is year 2 PRS. I'm not sure who that is. My question comes from the ecological side. Do you think that we sometimes idealized our cultures in our attempt to construct a decolonized approach? For example, your appeal to the totemistic Fijian culture appeals to idealized Fijian notion of Vanua that never existed in reality. In our attempt to respond to the technocratic modern Western version of the world, we appeal to an idealized vision of our culture that never existed in reality. Deforestation, overfarming, etc., are part of the pre-colonial oceanic cultures.
Thank you. I think that's a very important question. I'm not sure how the questioner is using the word idealized, because I'm not sure where this person lives, because I'm sure that in the communities that I've visited, I'm not a Fijian myself, but the totem cultures is very, very much alive in the communities in Fiji. And of course, it's also very much alive in the national registry of the Fijians. So it can be idealized, but when we also experience it in person, face to face, or relationships with people in the communities, we'll see that there are different dynamics of how they deal with that totemistic culture. And perhaps the second part of the question is in relation to deforestation, overfarming, which is says we're part of the pre-colonial oceanic cultures. I'm not sure what does that mean, but I'm sure I can surely say that it's not part of pre-colonial. It's part of our current systems where there's a lot of deforestation. For example, in Melanesia, there's a lot of overfarming, commercial farming around the Pacific that is also destroying our lands and our oceans. So it goes back to the idea of how do we go back to learn from our communities, even if it's something that is lost, but it's still in ideas of our people. Those values are very critical, and those values we can retrieve to ground a new version of education or a new story of development. And it means, therefore, that we have to go back and look at the strategy on how to action, again, those important values that have become idealized, if I put it in the words of the person who asked the question. So if it doesn't matter if it exists as a living reality in Fiji or in around the Pacific, or as a thinking aspect. It doesn't matter. What matters is that both in the thinking and a living reality has some very critical foundational elements that can help us move forward to restoring a new kind of development narrative or new kind of educational narrative in the future.
Thank you. That was a great answer to quite a complex question. Look, I'm just aware we've got 3 minutes to go. I think I might bring this webinar to a close, and just really my heartfelt thanks for your kōrero today. Upolu is very interesting to me personally. I think it touches on the interests of many people who are here today. Just to let people know, we haven't actually been able to put into the chat, since it seems to be disconnected because of the way the webinar is set up, but a recording of the seminar will be available on the Nitro website, and that will hopefully be available next week, and you can find out more about that. So if you want to Google Nitro, NITRO /Oceania.net, you'll get to those resources. So again, once again, thank you very much, Upolu. I'll close with a karakia, and that will bring our conversation to a close today. So, ka whakaerea te tapu, kia wātea ai te ara, kia turuku whakataha ai, kia turuku whakatai ai, homie hui tai kie. So that means restrictions are moved aside, so the pathway is clear to return to everyday activities. Join all together, bind all together, let it to be done. Kia ora koutou, thank you everybody, and I hope our paths cross at some other time. Kia ora.
Thank you.